When you hear people talk about the Candyman, most people associate that with the horror movie titled Candyman, where a murderous soul is summoned with a hook for a hand murdering his victims in horrific ways. But the real Candyman is not far from the movie, in the sense that all the victims suffered horrible and tragic deaths. Born in Fort Wayne, Indiana on December the 24th, 1939, Dean Corll was the oldest of two boys. His parents were Mary and Arnold Corll, and while his parents were never abusive or violent, the house certainly was tense and filled with arguing. While Arnold was very strict with the children and valued hard discipline, Mary was very overprotective of her two boys. This difference led to many fights and arguments until 1946. 4 years after the birth of their second son, Stanley, Mary and Arnold decided to get a divorce. Not long after the divorce, Arnold was drafted into the Air Force and was sent to Tennessee, and Mary followed him there, selling their house and moving in an effort to keep the children near their father, regardless on her feelings toward him. In 1950, Mary and Arnold had made up and decided to get remarried, once again uprooting the kids and moving them to Pasadena, Texas. Unfortunately, once again in 1953, the two of them decided to get divorced again, with Mary having full custody of the children all over again. Sadly, Dean and Stanley had no stability in their younger childhoods, with their parents' marriage constantly fluctuating and being forced to move every few years. In 1955, Mary eventually remarried a man by the name of Jake West, who was a traveling clock salesman, and the two of them had a daughter while living in Texas. They eventually decided to start a candy company together, which they called the Pecan Prince. Dean and his younger brother Stanley both worked in the family's company constantly when they were younger, being mainly in charge of operating the candy-making machinery, which also kept them from being able to appreciate and experience their childhoods. Dean was a shy and quiet kid who kept mostly to himself, and unfortunately he spent most of his younger years incredibly sick. At age 7, he contracted rheumatic fever, but somehow it went undetected and untreated until he was 11 years old, when doctors discovered he had a heart murmur. When he was older and in high school, Dean was still considered solitary, and was overall an average student. His only real passion in high school seemed to be in the brass band, which he played the trombone, but after graduation in 1958, Dean dropped that passion. By the time Dean graduated, the Pecan Prince Company was beginning to expand, and he moved with the rest of his family to Houston, Texas. However, 2 years later in 1962, he would move back to his birthplace in Indiana to live with his widowed grandmother. While in Indiana, Dean actually entered a relationship with a woman who would eventually propose to him. However, he rejected her and moved back to Texas to help with the family business. In 1963, Jake and Mary got divorced, and Mary made her own rival candy company to the Pecan Prince, calling it the Corll Candy Company, with Dean actually becoming the vice president. During this time, Mary had to choose to fire a teenage boy that was making complaints over Dean making sexual advances toward him. Unfortunately, this would be a common issue with teenage boys that worked at the candy company. In August of the following year, Dean would get drafted into the military and sent out of Texas for basic training, before eventually coming back to Texas to be permanently stationed at Fort Hood. While in the military, Dean realized that he was homosexual and had his first encounters. Dean was honorably discharged in June the 11th of 1965 and went back home to help out with the family candy company. Later in 1965, the company moved to Houston Heights, across from an elementary school, where Dean would give out candy to the local kids, especially teen boys, earning himself with the nickname of the Candyman and the Pied Piper. Dean was a lot less subtle on the way he would come on to any of the teenage male employees, and he even set up a pool table in the back of the factory where teenage employees and local kids could get together and hang out. 2 years had passed, and in 1967, Dean became friends with a 12-year-old boy by the name of David Brooks. David Brooks came from a broken home and divorced parents, and as he traveled to visit his two parents, he made sure to stop and stay at Dean's apartment because it became like a second home to him. Whenever David was in need of cash, Dean was always able to provide, which led David viewing him like a father figure. Tragically, Dean had been grooming him all along, and by 1969, he convinced David to allow him to perform oral sex on him in exchange for cash and gifts. By this point, the Corll Candy Company had shut down, and both Mary and Dean's stepsister moved to Colorado. A year after their relationship turned sexual, David walked into Dean's apartment only to see him assaulting 2 teenage boys, but Dean was able to buy David's silence by offering him a car. Then Dean made a terrible deal with David. Dean convinced David to help him lure victims into his apartment by promising to pay David for his work, and David agreed. Their first victim was an 18-year-old by the name of Jeffrey Cohen. While trapped in the apartment, Jeffrey was brutally assaulted, tortured, and eventually strangled to death. This same year, David also helped Dean lure 2 other boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, where they both fell to the same fate as Jeffrey Cohen. On January the 30th of 1971, Dean and David kidnapped 13-year-old and 15-year-old brothers Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Then from March to May of the same year, Dean also used David's help to kill 15-year-old Ronald Harvey, 13-year-old David Hilgeist, and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle. David was even willing to lure his own friends to their demise at the hands of Dean. In the fall of 1971, David lured an unknown number of young boys to the apartment, where they were kept, trapped, and alive for 4 days before being killed. At the end of the same year, David brought over a friend by the name of Elmer Wayne Henley, likely so he could be killed by Dean. However, Dean ended up talking and liking Elmer and offered him the same deal he had made with David. Dean somewhat hid his true intentions from Elmer, however, and instead of telling them right out about the murders, he told him that he was involved in a white slavery ring. Elmer initially rejected Dean's offer, but decided to accept after his family came onto hard times and were desperate for money. Over a course of time, Elmer assisted in luring the victims to the apartment and eventually helped David and Dean bury the bodies. From 1972 to 1973, the trio sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled 17 other boys. This murder spree would eventually come to a close in the latter half of 1973. On the night of August 7, 1973, Elmer brought a 19-year-old boy by the name of Timothy Carlisle to Dean's apartment, as well as another friend, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Rhonda Williams. Dean was infuriated that Elmer brought a girl to his apartment, telling Elmer that he apparently ruined everything. Elmer explained that she had issues with her family and she did not want to go back home. Dean apparently calmed down and even offered the kids alcohol and weed, and around 3 hours later, all the teens had passed out. Elmer then got a rude start when he awoke and found that Dean had gagged and handcuffed all 3 teenagers. Dean reiterated to Elmer on how furious he was for him bringing a girl to the apartment, but Elmer was able to convince Dean to free him so he could participate in the torture and murders. Dean instructed Elmer to sexually assault and kill Rhonda while he dealt with Timothy. Elmer walked over to Rhonda, who asked, "Is this for real?" To which Elmer responded, "Yes." Then Rhonda responded, "Are you going to do anything about it?" That statement struck a nerve within Elmer, and he grabbed Dean's pistol and threatened to shoot him, saying that it has gone too far. Dean egged him on, saying that Elmer would not shoot him, right before he got shot 6 times, ultimately killing him. The 3 teens then contacted police shortly after. Elmer was placed under arrest, with David Brooks' arrest following soon after. Elmer gave a full in-depth conversation to the police and even led them to the body dumping sites, where police would end up recovering 28 bodies.
So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century.
What did he want you to do?
He wanted to pay me to find people and bring them to him, and help him do his thing, and kill him, and help him bury him.
Did you?
I'll pay you.
He was going to pay you. How much would he pay you per person?
I don't know. He said $1,500 once.
$1,500 a person.
That's what he said.
Hello?
Mama,
Who's this?
it's Wayne.
Yes, this is Mama, baby.
Mama,
Huh?
I killed Dean.
Wayne?
Ma'am?
What are you doing?
Yeah, yes,
Oh, God. Where are you?
it's all right.
Wayne?
It's all right. It's all right.
Where are you?
I'm out of his warehouse.
Where?
Out at that warehouse he keeps.
Can I come out there?
Yeah, yes. No.
It's on Highland Park.
You can't. No, you can't come. I'm with the police, Mama.
Death in most cases came after the victims had been subjected to various sex acts and torture. The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens. Henley said he and 2 other young people were intended victims Wednesday morning. At that time, they had passed out at Corll's house after an all-night party.
I woke up and he was clamping handcuffs on me.
Henley's initial story makes it sound as if he were in effect a hero. But police suspicions were confirmed the next day. Henley said he had been involved in the murder and burial of some victims found in the dirt floor of this storage shed.
I never said there were 30 people. I said 24. The name's Junior, not Elmer Wayne Henley.
Judgment was passed, with Elmer getting charged 6 counts of murder and David only getting charged for the murder of 1 person. Elmer is currently alive and serving his sentence in a Texas prison, while David died in 2020 due to complications with COVID-19. So what do you think? Leave your thoughts and comments below. If you're into true crime, paranormal, and cryptids, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. And until next time.